Hello and welcome to another video. So this time around we are going to be taking a look at AI tools for game development. So this is a pretty complex area and it's an area that there's a lot of discussions about. So I want to talk a little bit first about what this video is going to be and what it is not going to be. So it isn't going to be a strong endorsement of AI tools or a whole heap of hype about them. It also isn't going to be a strong condemnation of them, of doom and gloom that we're about to have a Skynet situation or we're all out to be out of our jobs. It also isn't going to be a really deep analysis of how the tools work. What I want to instead do is I want to give context and background info on the tools. So I'll talk a little bit about how they work because there are some aspects of that I think it's actually really important to understand about for them. And I want to link out to other sources, which I'll do at the very end, that I feel are solid and that I think give some useful, relevant context about the various AI tools. And very much this is my opinions. So I'll be providing context on how I've come to those opinions and talking through why, but it is very much my opinions of stuff. It is opinions of someone who has been working with AI for a long time, but it is still, just an opinion. So what tools are we talking about? So we have things for synthesizing speech. So for converting from text into speech, there are tools that can convey different tones. So you can have, text where it might be there sounding angry or happy or sad. So those are aspects that can be included. And some of them can also be trained upon samples of real people's voices and can then replicate as if it was that person talking. Image generation is a fairly well-known one, and so how they generally work is that they can generate an image based upon prompts. Those prompts could be very high level, and they could also be very detailed. So you could get very specific that, you want an image that contains these particular elements and that is in a particular style. So you can get quite detailed with the prompts there, and then it can use that for generating those images. There is also, and this is probably the even more well-known one now, of the various chat tool style ones. So these are ones that you kind of have a conversation with. They can do things like generate code or modify or refactor code, locate information. So they do a lot of different things like that. But how do all of these work? So this is going to be a very high-level description. Again, there's a lot of depth to the technology behind these. There's a lot of intricacies for it, but I want to give a general overview of how these typically work. So at a very broad level, they're given training data that they use to build associations on knowledge. And so that might be samples of people's voices saying particular words. It could be things like, well, here's an image and here's the text associated with it. There's lots of different things that could be there in that training data, but that's at the broad level. They build up these associations very much in the way that we also learn by building up associations. And the way a lot of learning happens is you get information and you build up those associations. So, for example, we have sources like Common Crawl, which is a copy of the internet, basically. And it is accessible for researchers and other things like that. And it is a copy of the internet. So there are things derived from that. So there is a image database derived from that contains a link to an image and the associated alt text for it. And now that information, it might go through a filtering process to remove out particular things. It can be mixed in with other data sets, so it's not a case of you just use one data set. It can be a case of using several, and quite a few of the tools do use multiple data sets. And the data is also able to be weighted. So not all information gets treated with the same level of authority, essentially. So you could have one data set where it's like, this is going to give a very broad base, but it's not super authoritative. And it might be then you have another data set that is really narrow in scale and scope, and it actually is treated as more authoritative, but it has a smaller domain of knowledge. So that information is then all combined, with the goal being to build up as accurate and as comprehensive a set of associations as possible. So the goal is always with these to have it, learn accurate things, and for it to be a as wide a range as possible. So, okay, how do these tools get used in game development? How can they be? So one of the things is actually accessibility for developers. And this is something that I've actually been able to have really good benefit from. Since the surgery, my left arm and hand has been needing to go through a fair bit of recovery. So that's meant that it's been difficult at times to do a lot of typing. So things like the AI-powered autocomplete that learns and adapts to what you're doing in Visual Studio has actually been really helpful. It's allowed me to write similar amounts of code in a similar time, but with less usage of my left hand to give it more of a chance to recover. So really beneficial there in allowing me to be, continuing to do things that I enjoy doing, or things that I even need to be doing, with a much lighter impact for me. They can be used for creating dialogue for characters, the things that they say, and also actually then the associated audio to go along with that. Generating things like concept art or art for actually using in the game can be done through these tools. Generating and refining a narrative, and in particular that's something where those conversation-based ones where you could provide it an initial one and then have it give more details, or you could ask it to rephrase things in a different style to expand upon stuff. And on the coding side, solving coding problems, generating stuff from prompts, debugging and improving code, adding in comments, things like that. And also finding resources and solutions, so leveraging that ability of it to have all these associations built up, and then to take those and be providing those back when you have a particular question, of giving you those useful resources. And this is an area that they do well. These tools, because they build up associations, can sometimes spot things that we can't. And that's why for a while now they've been being progressively trialed and used in the medical field, because there's a lot of potential there for them being able to interpret information from scans and spot the small details that a human might miss. It's probably never going to replace a human looking at it, but it's still something that might be able to spot things that a person can't. So there's a lot of value to these. And they also can act as a bit of a rubber duck, because they can have a conversation with you, you can talk through a problem with them, and that can help for finding a solution. So, okay, there's a lot of really great benefits to them, but there are a lot of issues and concerns being expressed. So what are some of the ones that are getting raised there? One of the things is that copyright gets a little bit complex with AI-generated material. And just recently, the US Copyright Office ruled that AI-generated images themselves, so ones generated from a prompt, aren't copyrightable. The person who entered the prompt doesn't own the copyright to the image that was generated. The arrangement of the images, or additions, modifications to them can be, and potentially modifying the image sufficiently would also allow it to be copyrighted. However, not a lawyer, not legal advice. Do want to make that clear. Now, copyright, as far as I've seen, hasn't been fully tested yet for code or sort of textual based work, so narratives, things like that. So I don't know if the same thing would happen there. However, if the ruling's gone one way with AI-generated images, that could easily go a similar way with code or text. However, it's more common with those that we are modifying and combining them into larger works, so they may be safer. But again, not a lawyer, so I can't say for certain. It likely wouldn't surprise me that we'll see in the next few years a lot of things like of this being tested, because it is going to be a larger and larger thing. AI is not going away, and these issues aren't going away, and so decisions are going to have to be made on it. There are other factors as well. So the training data is not always sourced ethically for these tools. Varies a lot from tool to tool. But the dataset providers that they use, things like Common Crawl or the image database, don't make any guarantees that the data is perfectly usable in terms of copyright. And checking the copyright is actually pretty complex. Like, the image database is a URL and the text. Now, that URL could be, especially if it's coming from a large website, could be anything, and tracking that back down would need a lot of cooperation with large website providers. Particular things where images, stuff like that are being hosted, linking that back is non-trivial. It's a huge process, and it would also be challenging to automate. So there are images that have been used in these without artists' consent. And that's a particular problem when people can say, okay, generate this, and it's in this style of this particular artist, and it can be very closely replicating their work. So that's quite a problem. And also on the code side, there has been a lot of open source code used as training data. And that's, again, been done without the consent of the open source providers. Now, from a legal point of view, I'm not sure exactly where that stands, because accessing it is certainly fine, but some open source software has licenses that require that license to be reproduced in full if any of the code is used. Some of it prohibits its usage in commercial software. So there's some murky issues there, I think, with open source code having been used for training, and in particular being used like that without consultation with the different providers, because there might be plenty of ones that would be willing to have their code used, but there might also be ones that very specifically do not want it to be used. And so it's a problem that they've all been grouped together, and just the consent has been not even checked there, and that's not really appropriate. And the filtering of inappropriate content has been done in some pretty concerning ways. So obviously one of the things with these tools being rolled out on a larger scale is they want to make sure that the tools are not saying things that are offensive, or saying things that are just outright illegal if people were doing them. There's a lot of things that could be really problematic with these tools, being trained on essentially just a database of stuff that could contain anything. So filtering of stuff has happened, and some of the companies used for doing that filtering have paid pretty atrocious wages, and are doing it in countries where they're more able to get away with that, and that's, again, not okay. But it's sort of, I think, even worse than that is this content isn't just someone saying something offensive or an image that's offensive. This can be content that is highly illegal, that is highly disturbing for someone to have to actually see or read, and that people are having to do this without the appropriate support to actually ensure that they're okay afterwards. Because it's, again, I'll have links to the sources that talk a little bit more detail about the particular content. I don't want to in this video, but it's stuff I wouldn't want to be reading, and I would be very concerned for anyone having to be reading it without having the appropriate mental health support there to make sure that they're okay. So I think that's really concerning, that to make these tools, essentially good citizens, they have put people through some pretty incredibly awful content and done so without support and without good remuneration there. I think that's a real issue. And one of the big things with AI is AIs can be biased, because if the training data has biases, then we'll get biases in the results. And the answers can also be wrong, because these tools aren't truly intelligent. And that's one of the things, we tend to really hype these up. And it's very easy to get super excited about them and to think that these are way more intelligent than they are. And that's because human nature. We project generally our emotions, our intelligence onto other things. It's like we see faces in clouds and on rocks and on trees. We look at particular animals and we're like, that one's smiling, that one's happy, that one's sad. And well, absolutely, there is an emotional state there that animals are going to experience emotions, and that that can be for many of them quite a complex emotional state there. We've seen that with a lot of animals, that there is a lot of intelligence and a lot of emotional complexity there. But I think it's presumptuous and arrogant for us to assume that they necessarily feel in the same way that we do, or that their set of emotions are actually the same as ours. And in particular, that they visibly manifest the same way as ours. They likely don't. And so projecting this onto an AI is a kind of thing we tend to do. So we look at it and like, this is super intelligent. And it's not, because they don't reason, they don't understand, they don't extrapolate information in the ways that we can, and with the nuance and the complexity that we can. They don't even do it with the nuance and complexity of most animals. There's a lot of intelligence and a lot of ability to reason that animals have that these AIs aren't even at that level yet. So it's important to understand that they're not as clever as we tend to think they are. They build associations, but they can spot associations that we miss. As I said, in that medical field, there's some really promising stuff happening there, and a really great potential for them being able to greatly benefit the health of folks, which is fantastic. But we need to know enough about the area we're asking to be able to assess that the information we're being given is accurate. And that's one of the things, it's very easy to, through these tools, access information, in particular the conversation-based ones. But we need to know that it's correct. We need to know that it's giving us useful, accurate information. And it doesn't always, because it can learn bad associations. One of the things with learning is sometimes you learn the wrong thing. You learn information that isn't correct because you might have been presented with sources that were incorrect, or we can sometimes draw the wrong conclusions from stuff. That happens. And if it's going to happen for us, then it's also going to happen for things like an AI that has less capabilities to sort of spot that than we do. So, okay, where do we stand with all of these things? Copyright and legality in general, those are still being decided. We're going to see, I think, a lot of court cases over the next few years looking at and testing where AI-generated content stands. But I think it doesn't look promising. Certainly the image generation field, I think, is very high risk for using that in anything that you are wanting to own the copyright for. That feels very high risk to me. Other areas, I think there's less of a risk, but I think we're going to see cases testing that in the next few years. I think that's quite likely. The tools, like I said, they have a lot of potential. Gathering information, spotting problems, there is a huge potential there. Providing things that make it more accessible and easier to develop stuff. There's a lot of really good value to these tools. but we overstate their intelligence. So we need to be cautious about buying into the hype about them. And there's a lot of hype about them. And I think one of the things we're also going to see over the next few years is probably a bit of a boom and bust of a lot of AI-based startups making very wild claims and then not delivering on them and eventually folding. So be cautious about the claims being made about any AI tools, and be a little skeptical. Do some background checking to see, okay, is this actually really doing what they say it does, and really sort of test those limits there with it. And one of the things also that hasn't gone away, it is getting more and more attention, which I think is good, in particular on the image side of things, the art side of things. There's a lot of very valid, very significant ethical concerns around the training data used for many of those tools, both in terms of how it's sourced and also in terms of then how it's filtered and how that processing happens. And those concerns have not gone away, and they haven't been fully addressed yet. And I think that is something that hopefully, that's something that I very much hope we're going to see a lot more attention given to in the next few years. Because I would have a lot less concerns with these tools if they were done with folks' consent. So I have a lot of code up online. With all of the tutorials that I've done, there's a huge swath of code. I've got template code, things like that up there. I would be very happy to opt that code in for usage in AI training. But I completely understand and 100% support any other person creating content where they don't want that to be included in training data. I think that's something that it absolutely needs to be respected, and the default shouldn't be that you must opt out. I think the default should actually be that you must opt in. Now, places are generally not going to like doing that because that means less data by default. People have to do an extra step to opt into it, but I think there needs to be something like that happening to make it so that this data is sourced ethically. And if filtering is done, which filtering almost absolutely should be done to ensure that there is nothing that is highly inappropriate in there, that needs to happen in a ethical, responsible way as well. So that's where I think we sort of stand. There's a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of very valid concerns there. So what about me? Where do I stand with this? What do I think? So I don't intend to really use any of the AI tools in my work at this point. Beyond the autocomplete in Visual Studio, that's as far as I would be going. I wouldn't be using any of the code-based tools, certainly wouldn't be using any of the image generation-based ones, or any of the code generation-based ones. Again, beyond that Visual Studio autocomplete. And that's for a few reasons. Big thing for me is that training data sourcing. I am not prepared to use them until that data is sourced in an ethical manner. Now, it's very hard to exist in society and ensure that everything that you do is only interacting with things that are ethical. It's very difficult. But there are things that I think, where there is an opportunity where it's something you can opt out of and avoid, for me, I prefer to. So I'm not going to be using them from that point of view. And I don't also want to take on the risk that, if I use the images, that could be breaching copyright. And it's important to be crediting the people whose work stuff is based on. And code as well might have issues there. Even if it's an accidental breach of copyright, that's something that I don't want to have happen. I really think it's important to make sure you're giving credit where credit is due. and the creators of the works deserve to have stuff credited. If it was a case where, okay, it's generating, artists have consented to their work being included, and you get a generated image, and it was things where it's like, cool, here is what it's being sourcing from, here's some of the references, things like that. Stuff like that I think is starting to make it a bit more reasonable and appropriate. Same for code solutions. If those include references so that you can check out where it's coming from, I think that's really important. And one of the big things, because there's a lot of doom and gloom about them taking our jobs, I'm not worried about an AI taking my job, and I don't think we should be worried about that anytime soon. I'm not worried about it taking the jobs of any of the folks that I work with. I work with a lot of incredibly talented programmers and artists and writers, designers, folks across a whole range of fields, and their work is always, from everything I've seen, is always way better and way quicker than I think, anything I've seen from an AI. So, very much for me, I have got no qualms about any of my colleagues being replaced with an AI anytime at all. And I don't think that is something that we're going to likely see happen. I think what's more likely to see is we'll settle on a middle ground where there are AI tools that act as an assist, as an augment to what we're doing. I think that is more likely is as an assistant rather than as a replacement. And big thing, I'm going to keep watching the developments because I love the AI field. It's something an area I've worked in for over 20 years. It's an area I really love, find it fascinating, and I really want to see what things happen next. And I hope that the movement that we see is towards something where I'm more willing and wanting to be using the tools and feel comfortable using them in projects and feel comfortable recommending them. Would be really great to be in that position. So as I mentioned, I do have a bunch of sources that have used him sort of putting this stuff together, and I'm going to put in the description a link to this presentation so you'll be able to access those sources there. But they're ones that I do recommend sort of checking out, getting a bit of an understanding of sort of where these tools get their data from, how some of that data gets used and processed, and things like that. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting. If you're looking for the slides, there is a link to those in the description below. If you have any questions, if there's particular areas that you would like me to talk about in more detail, or you'd like more information on, you've got questions about, then chuck those in a comment below. And until next time, bye.